Chaos, crashes, penalties and rain, Silverstone delivers once again as Lando Norris claims home victory in the British Grand Prix as Oscar Piastri receives a huge penalty. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, where on earth do we begin? Silverstone, as I said, delivered once again. I don't know what it is about the British Grand Prix. It is just every single year. First things first, I'm giving myself a pat on the back. I was correct with the weather forecast. After all, we had rain.
Whatever.
We had shine. We then had heavy rain and yet more shine. We had a penalty for Oscar Piastri, a spin for Max Verstappen, Nico Hulkenberg on the podium. In fact, the driver there is probably the least to talk about is the race winner, Lando Norris.
I don't know. I'll do what my son does to me, mate, and I'll go, whatever, like that, the W and the E. Yeah. I know we talked heavily about the weather, and for the most part, well, I got qualifying right. You said it was going to rain on Saturday.
I did.
So let's call it a win-win on both that parts. Okay, I got Saturday right, you got Sunday right. Yes. Wow. Where do we start? As you say, heavy downpours, late morning through the early afternoon, faded as the race began, but nevertheless it left all the field starting on intermediates because the track was wet in some places. We'll talk about the tyre gambles in a few seconds or a few minutes, obviously, but overall, Lando Norris, a winner at his home Grand Prix for the first time in his F1 career, back-to-back victories as well for the first time in his career, which has now propelled him to just within 8 points of teammate Oscar Piastri in the driver's standings. This looks like, Nick, at the halfway stage of the season, it could be a driver's title race that will go all the way to the wire if these two are going to go at it hammer and tongs as they are right now.
Which we hope will be the case. But let's discuss Oscar, because out of the two McLaren drivers, he is, despite the fact it's Lando winning on home soil, the bigger talking point because he did get himself into the lead in the opening laps. Max Verstappen, who we'll discuss in a few moments, having real issues in the RB21 as he kind of feared if the rain was going to hit the circuit. But Oscar was looking somewhat comfortable, had Max and Lando fairly close, but didn't look under any real threat until the safety car restart for a second safety car and, well, a 10-second time penalty for erratic braking and also 2 penalty points, ultimately costing him the race win. I have not seen Oscar so tight-lipped and visibly angry as he appeared.
Yeah, he obviously had to contain himself both in the immediate interview that takes place of the top three once they've stepped out of their cars and before the podium ceremony takes place. And then he didn't really elaborate too much further when he stepped into the press conference media room here at Silverstone. The only bit that you could really add was that he was confused with the penalty based on the fact that he got this 10-second penalty, but in referencing what happened back in Canada, and you remember there when George Russell hit the brakes behind the safety car and Max Verstappen again was the driver who edged past. No penalty for George Russell in that incident. The stewards in this case, of course, took into account the conditions, bearing in mind the wet track, the spray that was flying up into Max Verstappen and his Red Bull, and the fact that Max had to take evasive action. The brake from Oscar was 218 kilometers an hour down to 52 kilometers an hour, literally in the blink of an eye. So they deemed that to be effectively a form of erratic driving, and they decided to impose what ultimately proved to be a race-winning costly penalty, a potential race-winning. He would have won the race, but for that, effectively. And the best thing you can say out of it was Max Verstappen's comments afterwards, when he turned around and thought that the penalty for Oscar was extreme. So when you think that that's Max's own words, then you can perhaps understand what I'm now about to tell you with regard to Andrea Stella's comments post-race as well. Andrea was 20 minutes late for his session with the written media, which is hugely unusual because he is an extremely punctual and precise guy. he couldn't understand why in this instance, given all the circumstances around that incident, that the stewards made their verdict relatively swiftly. I was quite surprised when it came up, actually, and I'm sure many others were as well, that the stewards called for an investigation, and literally within a few minutes later, they determined slam dunk 10-second penalty. You would have assumed, and this is what Andrea was hoping for, and it is something that he will be talking with the race director, Ruben Marquez, and the FI stewards about, that there were so many extenuating circumstances around this incident that it should have been one of those that a post-race investigation would have been more appropriate. Because if you have Max Verstappen defending Oscar Piastri, saying, actually, I didn't have to take that much of an evasive action, I was okay, then Oscar would not have got that 10-second penalty, in-race penalty. It probably would have been something far less, maybe a warning, maybe even only 5 seconds, who knows? Nevertheless, we had these circumstances now. The stewards decided to act swiftly rather than retrospectively after the event in terms of conducting that investigation post-race.
And obviously what was really interesting is, Max came out and said that Oscar's penalty was very harsh, and who knows, this could be an interesting turning point actually in the championship. But speaking of turning points, let's discuss Max quickly, because I mean, what a day for the Dutchman, one which he'll probably be leaving with his head scratching. Red Bull, as we discussed in Saturday's F1 update, made dramatic overnight changes to the RB21 from Friday into Saturday, to the extent it was effectively running a Monza-esque rear wing. That low downforce, quite stunning, which gave him really incredible pace in the dry. Max said himself after qualifying, please do not rain. Rain and I'm in big trouble. He was absolutely accurate, because from the get-go, the opening laps, which he did lead, his RB21 sliding in particular through Maggots and Beckett's, in the end, actually after that second safety car restart, before the race had truly gotten back underway, Max span, which is something you see so rarely from him in these tricky conditions, summarising just how difficult his car was to control, dropped him back to 10th, recovered into 5th. But I mean, in the end, a very good recovery by the four-time world champion.
It was superb. I mean, he must have been, in those conditions, he must have been pretty much hanging on for dear life with that car.
It looked like
through
it.
through the real high-speed Maggots-Beckett's complex, as you talked about just there, because of that Monza-esque wing. Red Bull really took a gamble with that wing, and it paid off beautifully with that qualifying lap. Another one of those laps that we will look back on as one of the all-time best, because it really was truly stunning what he delivered. Because as we talked about post-qualifying on Saturday, at that stage, Max was there or thereabouts, but we never really thought he was going to be in contention to land pole until he actually went and landed pole with what proved to be the very last lap of the top 10 shootout. But as you've pointed out again, the last thing that Max wanted was rain, and it rained a lot. Not only pre-race, but obviously there was a good downpour as well during it, and that obviously heavily compromised him for that safety car restart. Rare spin, but once again, unlike others that couldn't hold on to their cars in spins off track, he somehow managed to do that. As you say, fell from 2nd to 10th. That effectively cost him a potential podium shot. But once again, Max fought beautifully with that car, managed to hang on for dear life, as I say, throughout the rest of that Grand Prix, and conjured a good 5th position. It has left him now, though, even further adrift of the leading McLaren drivers, Oscar and Lando. And at this halfway stage, it's looking extremely, extremely difficult now for Max to hang on to his driver's title. And of course, that number 1 on his Red Bull. We could very well see MV33 back for next season, the rate things are going on.
Yeah, Max now 69 points adrift of Oscar. Let's move on, though, to the driver who ultimately then moved into 3rd after overtaking Lance Stroll on his, let me get this right, 239th F1 start. The story of the day, sorry, Lando, Nico Hulkenberg is a Formula 1 podium finisher. It is the story of the day, potentially could end up being the feel-good story of the season. And I mean, there were chants of Nico, there's going to be a party in the Stake Sauber garage long into the night, you would imagine.
Yeah,
What a moment for Nico, 19th to 3rd.
And at one stage as well, you had to say that it looked like he was going to be denied.
Yeah.
Because bearing in mind the way the conditions were late in the race, transforming from wet to dry, Ferrari's Lewis Hamilton was coming at a rate of knots. At that stage, of course, it was Lance Stroll that was running in 3rd position behind the leading McLarens. And it was going to be, is Lance going to get a podium? But beautiful driving from Nico, managed to get past Lance Stroll. On the same lap, Hamilton also managed to pass Lance. And as I say, at that stage, it looked for all the world. Well, I think it was about 12 or 13 laps to go, something along those lines, as if Lewis was also going to get Nico. But all of a sudden, I think Lewis got within 1 second of Nico as he was chasing him. And then all of a sudden, you saw this huge drop off. As I say, bearing in mind, we saw the track going from wet to dry. Ultimately, he came in ahead of Nico Hulkenberg, and he thought, here we go. Lewis is now on slick tires. And when Nico comes in, you would have assumed that on slick tires, that Lewis Hamilton would have caught Nico Hulkenberg. Not a bit of it. Nico Hulkenberg actually went and set the fastest lap of the race at one stage. Such was his pace in that state car. And ultimately, he comfortably kept Lewis Hamilton at bay. And that 3rd place sparked huge cheers around Silverstone. And why not? Yeah. This, as you say, is a real feel-good story for Formula One. Nico has been on the cusp, as we know, throughout his career of a potential podium. He's been denied on a couple of occasions. It's looked for all the world as if he would go through his entire career without this podium finish. Nevertheless, he gets it. He gets driver of the day, and the podium celebrations that have taken place, not podium celebrations, but, well, yes, there were podium celebrations, of course, huge for Nico Hulkenberg, but the celebrations down at the Stake motorhome have been quite considerable. Champagne everywhere. Even my colleague, Jake Nicol, who just happened to be down there at the time, Jake has been with me this Grand Prix weekend, helping me out. Even he got a little bit of spray on his T-shirt. Such was all that champagne being sprayed everywhere, as I say. Loads of music being played out. Bit strange at one point when "We Are the Champions" started ringing out. A little unusual.
Why not?
Anybody would think Stake had won the Drivers' or Constructors' Championship on that basis, but hell, let them enjoy, let them have their fun, because this has just been absolutely superb for both Nico Hulkenberg and that team. And guess what, Nick? This is a tremendous stat. Nico Hulkenberg has now scored points in the last 4 races. More points than Red Bull has scored in those Grand Prix as well. So that just goes to show, that just goes to show the high that Nico Hulkenberg and Stake have been on, and the difficulties that Red Bull have endured over these past 4 Grand Prix.
Yeah, it's going to take some time getting used to calling Nico Hulkenberg an F1 podium finisher after all these years, 239 races, but he did it. To very quickly run through the top 10 from the British Grand Prix. Lando Norris claimed victory ahead of Oscar Piastri, Nico Hulkenberg in 3rd, Hamilton in 4th, Verstappen 5th, Pierre Gasly in a brilliant 6th, Lance Stroll in an equally brilliant 7th. Lots of very incredible standout performances from your midfield drivers. Alex Albon in P8, Fernando Alonso 9th, and George Russell in 10th after a day he called terrible, and we'll discuss Mercedes in much more detail in Monday's podcast. But a final talking point we have got to briefly touch on is Ferrari, because there was so much promise for Ferrari going into this weekend, going into today actually. So many teams suspecting they would be in the victory fight. To put their day into perspective, Jenson Button, following Sky F1's post-race coverage, said that whatever strategy Charles Leclerc goes for in mixed weather, you need to do the opposite. Ouch.
Oh dear, oh dear. I mean, I can't top that. What am I supposed to? How am I supposed to follow that, Rick? I mean,
It
this
just
is
didn't
coming
work,
from
did
an
it, for
F1
him?
world champion.
Yeah,
But they gambled. Ferrari
yeah.
gambled. Mercedes gambled. As we saw, or just touch on it very, very briefly, as we saw at the end of the formation lap. The formation lap was conducted behind the safety car, which I thought was really, really weird given the track conditions at that particular time. It was like, as Martin Brundle put it, what are the guys going to come do? Put training wheels on the side of those cars? They didn't need to be nursed behind the safety car for that formation lap. Anyway, 5 drivers came in after the formation lap to pit off those inters onto slicks. 2 of those drivers were George Russell and Charles Leclerc. And from that point on, that was a gamble that didn't work. And from that point on, for both those drivers, their races just unraveled. Further gamble for Mercedes with George, that didn't gamble later on. Also Ferrari, it was just a real mess on the Mercedes side of the garage, and also particularly on Charles Leclerc's side of the garage for Charles Leclerc.
We will discuss Ferrari, like Mercedes, in a lot more detail in Monday's podcast. Ian, amazing stuff as always. And for those watching this F1 update, please do let us know your thoughts on a chaotic British Grand Prix in the comment section below. In addition to that, please do smash the like button, subscribe to the channel. It means an awful lot to us. And we will see you on Monday for the podcast. See you later.
Thanks as always for watching, folks. Take care.